evening. I'm Kathy Campbell from the League of Women Voters of Amherst. Before we begin, I'd like to take a minute to thank the co-sponsors of this event, who are among the groups you've seen on your way in. They are the Town of Amherst, Sustaining Amherst, the Pioneer Valley Electric Auto Association, the Berkshire Environmental Action Team, and the League of Women Voters of Amherst. We hope you'll take time to learn more about their involvement in climate action. This event was organized by Kay Jones of Ashfield. We have several facilitators. I think at the moment they're still out in the lobby, but you'll recognize them because they're dressed in green and black, and they can help you if you need any assistance during the next couple of hours. In particular, they'll collect your written questions for the panel that will follow Dr. Bradley's talk. Just hold your questions. I don't know, were there some index cards on the way in? Yeah, and you can just, I think the facilitators will probably give you another card too if you need one. Just hold your hands up and they'll bring them over. So now I would like to present Stephanie Ciccarello, who's the Sustainability Coordinator for the Town of Amherst, to introduce this evening's speakers. Stephanie?
So our first presenter is no stranger to the Town of Amherst, and in particular the University of Massachusetts. A distinguished professor in the Department of Geosciences and director of the Climate System Research Center at UMass Amherst, he has written or edited more than a dozen books and over 200 articles on climate change. He has been an advisor to various government and international agencies, including the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change. Please give a round of applause to Dr. Ray Bradley.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here, and it's always nice to see so many old friends. So what I decided to do today was talk, to try to lighten up the discussion about climate change, because it is a rather depressing topic if you just focus on the science itself. And so I've titled this The Bad News and the Good News, or Some Good News about Climate Change. And I'll try to present both sides. And these two images you'll see later on, you can decide which is the bad news and which is the good news for yourself. So we'll start off with the bad news, and there is a lot of bad news, so I'll try to go through it and explain it and frame where we are today, and then we'll discuss some of the good news. So first of all, let's look at the actual facts. Contrary to what you may hear from a number of cabinet members and congressmen on the right, this is actually the record of global warming, and you can see quite clearly that temperatures are rising and have been rising, and we've reached a series of record-breaking temperatures. This is global average temperature based on literally thousands and thousands and thousands of records from all around the world. And we reference this to this 30-year period in the middle here. So this is what we call the baseline temperature. But we could use any baseline and it would look exactly the same in terms of the overall change. So the black dots here are the individual years. The red dot is a sort of a smooth version of that. And for those of you who are less than 40 years old in this room, half of all the carbon dioxide that has been produced by burning of fossil fuel has entered the atmosphere since you were born, which is a pretty astounding fact. So the rate at which carbon dioxide has been accumulating in the atmosphere has accelerated dramatically in the last few decades, bearing in mind that this really began at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and the end of the 1700s. So it's taken off, and no surprise, perhaps, that the temperatures have followed that, as we'll see in a minute. Now that's the global average, but if we look at the map of global temperature, and this is the 3 warmest years, which, as I said, are 3 of the most recent years, you can see that everywhere on the Earth, all the yellow and red colors represent temperatures that are above the long-term average. So everywhere is warming, and you can see clearly that things are warming more as we go up to higher and higher latitudes. And in fact, the polar regions are warming 2 to 3 times the average of the globe. And we call this Arctic amplification. And I'll explain why that is in a second, and you'll see for yourself. Now, we also know that the oceans themselves are warming, and what's happening in the oceans is that the heat that is accumulating in the atmosphere is slowly penetrating down into the surface of the ocean, and this represents how much heat is accumulated in the upper 2,000 meters of the ocean surface. So the oceans are getting warmer, and even if we were to stop the production of greenhouse gases tomorrow, that heat would slowly leak out of the atmosphere. And so basically we have a long-term process that will continue long after we eliminate the production of greenhouse gases, if we can do that. Furthermore, as that heat accumulates and the oceans warm, the volume of water expands, and that contributes to sea level rise, as we'll see shortly. Now, as for the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we've been measuring that since 1957, which was the first International Geophysical Year, and this is the baseline location where these measurements are made. It's in the summit of Mauna Loa in the island of Hawaii. It's high up. It's measuring the background level. It's nothing to do with urban pollution or any other industrial pollution. It's measuring the background levels in a very remote part of the planet. And when we look at the measurements that have been made there since 1957, what we see is a steady rise in carbon dioxide. But if we look closely, and I've just expanded this little part of the graph here, and you can see that there's a cycle that goes up and down. And what this represents is the annual cycle of the biosphere. So at this time of year, all the plants in the northern hemisphere, or the deciduous plants, leaf up, and they draw carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. They consume that carbon dioxide, and they create biomass, leaves and wood and so on. And that results in the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere going down. Then in the fall, when those leaves are released back to the atmosphere, they oxidize, and that CO2 goes back, and the level goes back up. And so what we see here is a cycle, an annual cycle. It's the breathing of the planet on a seasonal basis. And you can see clearly that that has been going on every year for the last part of this record. But in addition to that, we have this underlying rise in carbon dioxide on top of that breathing of the biosphere. And that black line is the increase in carbon dioxide from the production of fossil fuel, from the burning of fossil fuel. So what we're doing here, this process of the biosphere breathing has been going on for hundreds of millions of years. And indeed, it happened during the period when hundreds of millions of years ago, when plants were breathing and they were taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and that plant material eventually was transformed by geological processes into what we now think of as fossil fuel: coal, oil, natural gas, and so on. So we're burning that material and we're putting back into the atmosphere the carbon dioxide that was removed hundreds of millions of years ago. And we're doing it at a very, very fast rate, much, much faster than the rate at which that carbon dioxide was taken out of the atmosphere. So what we're seeing here is the normal process of seasonal changes, and then the effect of burning fossil fuels superimposed on that. And it really doesn't matter where you are on the planet. You can go to the middle of the Pacific, as we saw in the middle of the record from Hawaii, or we can go to the North Pole or even to the South Pole, and you will still see that seasonal cycle. And even at the South Pole, you see it, but it's very muted. But on top of that, we have this underlying trend. In other words, wherever you are on the planet, we're seeing the effects of this burning of fossil fuel, because the gases mix very quickly. The whole atmosphere is affected, the whole planet is affected by the accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And it does accumulate. It takes literally centuries for carbon dioxide to be removed from the atmosphere, because the processes by which carbon dioxide is taken out are very, very slow compared to the rate at which we're adding it to the atmosphere. Now, how do we know that 50 or 60-year record is unusual? Well, we don't have records before 1957, measurements, that is, with instruments, but what we do have are natural archives of the levels of carbon dioxide. And here we see an ice core that has been drilled through one of the big ice caps on the planet. In this case, Greenland, also Antarctica, is where we recover these ice cores. When snow accumulates on the top of these very, very cold ice sheets where it doesn't melt, as that snow accumulates and gets compressed by fresh snow, it gets compressed eventually into ice, and during that process, the gas in the atmosphere gets trapped in little bubbles inside the ice. So when we recover these ice cores, we drill down through the ice sheet, and as we drill down, we're basically going back in time. So if we take an ice core like this, we can sample the bubbles of gas, and we have a history of what the levels of carbon dioxide and other trace gases were in the atmosphere all the way back in time. And this is what it looks like for the last 1,000 years. So here we can see that going back 1000 AD, carbon dioxide was pretty much level. These are different sites where the ice cores were taken, so there's a little bit of variability. But you can see it stayed pretty steady around 280 parts per million. And then what happened? James Watt invented the steam piston engine in the 1780s, and the demand for coal began, and we started to burn fossil fuel. Then 100 years later, the internal combustion engine was invented, and that led to the demand for oil. And so collectively, we started to burn more and more fossil fuel, population increased, and we can see that the level of carbon dioxide started to go up. And here, right at the end here, is that 50 years of measurements that we had from Mauna Loa, Hawaii. And you can see that patches on perfectly with the long-term record that we have in the ice core. So the take-home message here is that for 1,000 years or so, carbon dioxide levels were pretty steady at 280 parts per million. And as the Industrial Revolution took hold, it's been going up and up, now almost vertically. This is an old graph. It's now a little bit over 410 or thereabouts, 410 parts per million, and rising very, very fast. Why do we care? Because carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, and what that means is it's transparent to energy that we receive from the sun, so-called short-wave radiation, but it's opaque to long-wave radiation, which is the energy that the Earth emits. So that energy comes into this from the sun, it heats the surface of the Earth, and then it's usually radiated away, and we have a balance. That's our temperature of the Earth is a result of that. But now we've put more and more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. That balance has been upset, and the heat is being retained in the atmosphere, and the result is global warming. Now, where do these fossil fuels come from? Or you can see here this graph, I think starts at 1900. And originally, almost all of the fossil fuel we used was coal. And as we went through time, it started to be more and more of the fuel was oil and natural gas. Now it's about 50-50 on a global basis. Where did it come from? Here we see the different countries that are responsible for the global totals of greenhouse gas emissions. So we go back to the 1800s, and it was almost all a result of fossil fuel consumption in Europe, principally in the United Kingdom. Then as we go through time, we can see more and more the United States becomes a big player, and more recently, you can see China has started to become important, and these other countries. This gray area, you probably can't even see. This is all the other countries in the world. Africa, all the African countries, South American countries, Southeast Asian countries. So you can see on the big picture here who's responsible for putting all that carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. These are the cumulative emissions. It's quite obviously the industrialized countries of Europe, United States, and it's only lately that China and to some extent India and Russia have become players in this big picture. So when you hear people pointing to China and saying, China is responsible for the problems we have, think back to this picture. It's a little bit different story. So let's recap. Warming is not equally distributed across the globe. High latitudes have warmed more than most other areas. The land has been warming more than the oceans, actually, but the oceans are storing heat and expanding in volume. This warming is going to continue even if we turned off the CO2 spigot tomorrow. Most of the CO2 in the atmosphere has come from fossil fuel consumption in the major economies of North America, Europe, to some extent Japan, not China or India. And CO2 stays in the atmosphere for many centuries. So what are the environmental consequences of that so far? Well, we hear a lot about changes in the Arctic, and those indeed are changing rapidly. Here we can see maps of the amount of ice in the Arctic Ocean at the end of the summer. So this should be the minimum amount of ice after it's all melted. This is 1879, and you can see going forward, here's the situation in 2012. Now you can see that it's possible to take ships right through the Bering Strait around the ice into Europe, and China and other countries have been doing that in recent years. The whole ecology of the marine environment is changing, and that has implications for not just for the Arctic, but also for North Atlantic and for the Pacific, because those species will be moving around and migrating. And we can see here the volume of ice has been declining, not just the area, but also the thickness. Now, why do we care about this? Well, these two maps show this quite nicely. As the ice recedes, and the blue areas here show the more open water, that darker surface is able to absorb more of the incoming sunlight. So when it was bright and shiny, it reflected most of the energy coming into the Earth in polar latitudes. But as it gets darker, it absorbs more energy. And you can see this map on the right shows how much of that area that is ice-free now is absorbing more and more of the energy. And that simply accelerates the global warming. So this is a positive feedback. It adds to the whole process that's going on of the planet warming itself. We also see recession of glaciers. This is Glacier National Park. You can see these different dates. The glaciers have been getting smaller and smaller. And it's happening everywhere on the planet, even down at the equator. This is Cotopaxi in Ecuador, right on the equator. It's a volcano, obviously. It has glaciers and ice caps on it. That has been shrinking. This is the area in 1976 and 1997. And then we can see the area of ice has been getting smaller as we go forward in time. This is the situation in Bolivia. Since 1975, they've lost 50% of their snow and ice. Why do we care? It's Bolivia, it's Ecuador. Who cares about those countries? Well, this is what's happening. These are the glaciers outside of La Paz, Bolivia. From 1940, you can step through going in time. You can see they've almost disappeared. Why we care is this was the major water supply for the city of La Paz, the largest city in Bolivia. How much has Bolivia contributed to the greenhouse gas problem? Almost nothing. And this is the same throughout the poorest countries of the world. These countries are the countries that are being affected by global warming, and yet they're not contributing to the problem in the first place. The big industrial countries, as I showed you, are the ones that produce this problem. And yet the people who are suffering are the poor developing countries like Bolivia, like Ecuador, and many countries in Africa. And I was down working in Peru. A farmer came up to me talking about global warming, and he said to me, why are you doing this to me? And it was a very difficult conversation because he was asking me as somebody from the United States, why aren't you solving this problem? We can't fix it. We didn't create it. And yet we are the ones who are suffering from it. So I think this creates a very uneven playing field across the planet. And we have to recognize that the reputation of the developing countries, of the developed countries, is viewed in that light by the developing countries and the poor people of the world. Why should we also care about these glaciers melting? Because that water doesn't just disappear. It ends up in rivers, and those rivers end up in the ocean. And they contribute to the rise in sea level. And we can see here that sea level has been rising and accelerating. The rate of rise has been getting faster. And this is the projected change that we can expect over the next few decades. This is very uncertain. We don't know exactly how global warming will develop, but the latest estimates are that somewhere between a foot and maybe 3.5 feet of sea level rise can be expected by the end of this century. And we're already seeing the results of that. This is in Miami, on Miami Beach. Now they're seeing more frequent so-called nuisance flooding when the tides are high. The water simply bubbles up through the drains and floods the roads, even without any sea level and any coastal storms. This is a nice sunny day, and they're getting this nuisance flooding. And we've seen it in other coastal cities too. This problem is only going to get worse. In Miami Beach, they've just spent, I think, $400 million trying to raise up these low-lying roads along the coast. Well, that's money that's not well invested, I would say, because they're just going to have to do it again before too long. And let's look a little closer to home. This is Boston. The orange areas on this map, you can see just at a glance, those are all within 2 feet of present sea level. So there's a lot of cities, not just Boston, but think about all the coastal cities around the world. New York, London, San Francisco, Buenos Aires, Tokyo. All the coastal cities around the world are going to have to face this problem. And of all the problems related to global warming, this one is not going away anytime soon. We've locked into this problem because the oceans are warmer and the glaciers are disappearing, and that water is going back into the oceans. So some cities have tried to get ahead of this game. This is London. They built the Thames Barrier across the River Thames. The city of London's up here. They've got these barriers that rise up when the tides are high, and it prevents the high water from entering the city. But they have to be open to allow shipping through. So it's a complicated engineering problem. And in today's dollars, this one defense costs $2 billion. So think about what that's going to cost on a global scale to to solve the problem. Okay, we're getting to the end of the bad news, but it's not quite over yet. So here's the next question. Okay, sea level's getting higher, but what about storms? It's storms that really drive the water to the coast, and they can accelerate or exacerbate the problem of sea level rise. So the question is, will it be more storms or stronger storms related to hurricanes? And this is still a research question. But I like this study that was done. It seems to me quite simple. This was a study where they looked at the temperatures of the sea between Africa and the Caribbean, or Africa and Florida, which is where the hurricanes develop. And they simply divided it into years when the sea surface was relatively cool or cold, and years when it was warm. And then they mapped the tracks of hurricanes. And you can see quite clearly, here's the two, this is the East Coast, here's the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. These are the warm years. And you can see very clearly there were many more hurricanes and storms during the warm years than there were in the cold years. So I think as the sea surface temperatures rise in what we call the main development region between Africa and Florida, we're going to see more and more of these big storms. Whether or not they make landfall, there are going to be more and more of these hurricanes, and they're going to drive the seas into coastal regions. And what's the result of that? This is the consequence of Hurricane Katrina. These are refugees. These are people in the Superdome. They had nowhere to go. Thousands and thousands of people displaced from their homes. And then in 2017, we had 3 massive hurricanes in a row. In Houston, 60 inches of rain in 48 hours. It's an unimaginable amount of rain. Why was that? Usually these storms stir up cold water and they kind of shut themselves off. But the water was so warm all the way to great depth that as the water was stirred up, it didn't cool off. It just stayed warm. And so more and more water was transported into the coastal regions, and it just dumped into Houston. $125 billion in damages. Hurricane Maria, within the same period, devastated many of the Caribbean islands. This is the British Virgin Islands. And not just infrastructure, but also agriculture. This is the Florida citrus groves from Hurricane Irma, completely waterlogged, and in many cases waterlogged with salt water, so that it wasn't anything that went away after the water receded. They had to deal with the salt in the soil. And lastly, this is a graph from Munich Re. These are the big insurance companies that insure the insurance companies. And you can see here the number of what they call relevant loss events has been increasing, mostly from hydrological and meteorological damages, flooding, strong winds, and property damage. And I was just reading this morning. In 2017, there was $340 billion in damage as a result of natural events. So these things are increasing in frequency, and it's going to cost us more and more going forward. For all of these reasons, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the sort of gold standard for this business, concluded in their last report, the warming of the climate system is unequivocal. No question it's happening. Many of the observed changes are unprecedented for decades or even millennia. The oceans and the atmosphere has warmed, the amount of snow and ice has diminished, sea level has risen, greenhouse gases have increased. Extremely likely that human influence is the dominant cause of this warming. And even the Defense Department, not Greenpeace here, climate change will affect the Department of Defense's ability to defend the nation and poses immediate risks to national security. Okay, we got to the end of the bad news. Are you okay with that? We have a good scientific understanding of these critical environmental problems. But there are solutions, and some actions are being taken. The problem is the politics of extremism have taken center stage. There's a vacuum of leadership at the political level in Congress, notwithstanding the congressman who's here, of course. But on the other side of the aisle, we have, I'll just give you a few examples and you can see the problem. Trump digs coal. He blames global warming is a fiction created by and for the Chinese in order to make manufacturing, US manufacturing, non-competitive. So who does he appoint to his cabinet? Max Tillerson. Of course, he represented Exxon for many years. Rick Perry, he's still there, one of the few cabinet members who is still there, I think. But he says, I don't believe global emissions are the main driver. It's the control knob is the ocean and this environment that we live in. So go figure what that means, I'm not sure. The science is still out. This is a meme, this is a refrain you hear over and over. We just don't know enough. And then, of course, Trump appointed Scott Pruitt. I wouldn't agree CO2 is the primary contributor. The war on coal is over. Scientists continue to disagree about the degree of global warming and so on. Same sort of theme. Well, he didn't last very long, so who did they appoint in his place? Andrew Wheeler. He was a former aide to James Inhofe, a Republican senator from Oklahoma, former coal industry lobbyist. Who was Inhofe? Inhofe is the guy who wrote the book, The Greatest Hoax, How the Global Warming Conspiracy Threatens Your Future. He was in charge of a Senate committee that dealt with global warming that called for the indictment of 17 climate scientists for violating federal law. I was one of those 17, so I felt rather strongly about this. Thankfully, the Justice Department did not pursue that call. I wrote about this in my book, Global Warming and Political Intimidation. They tried to destroy our reputations. They tried to stop the science that we were doing, and it was a very difficult time for all the people involved. So there's been a well-funded campaign of lies and deception, largely on the right in the Congress. And the result of that is the public thinks that scientists don't have an idea of what's happening, that there is still a lot of uncertainty, which is completely untrue. As a result, many don't rate global warming as a major concern. There's little consensus on what to do about it, whether it should be carbon tax or whatever. And importantly, there are no costs linked to greenhouse gas pollution. Unlike any other pollution, it's not regulated. And the energy industries and their allies have a lock on the Congress. They've managed to push this to protect their interests. Okay. Whew. You're still with me. We made it to the good news part. Well, sort of good news. Not all good news, but a lot of it is good. So, a couple of years ago, the so-called COP21, the Climate Conference of the Parties in Paris, came to an international agreement to reduce emissions, to try to limit the warming to no more than 2 degrees Celsius, 3.5 Fahrenheit, above the pre-industrial level. Now, bear in mind, we've already increased the temperatures by at least 1 degree, maybe a little more. So we're halfway there. But there was great enthusiasm, and it was a big achievement to get countries to sign up voluntarily and to create their own roadmap based on their own political and economic strategies, what they thought they could accomplish. It's a step. It's not an end product. It's a process towards reducing emissions to limit temperatures. The problem is, here's the 2 degrees target compared to the last 1,000 years. This is our hockey stick diagram, temperatures over the last 1,000 years. Here's where we are today. Here's where we're projected to go if we don't do anything about controlling greenhouse gases. So this is the target that they aim for. But if you read through what everybody is currently committed to, it doesn't reach that target. It's up here. So that's why I call it a step. It's a first step towards reaching that target, and it certainly has to be ratcheted down if we're going to meet that target. And of course, it doesn't help that President Trump has said that the U.S. will not participate in this process. Well, we'll see. We'll see that is not quite the case anyway. So the good news is that even though the federal government has been somewhat impotent about taking the necessary measures, a lot is happening in other countries and a lot is happening in different states. Cities are taking action, businesses are acting, individuals are acting, and I'll show you some examples. Yesterday, Britain became the first major country in the G7 to set a net zero emissions target for 2050. So the idea is that they would try to balance the renewable energy they use with the renewable energy that they produce. And interestingly, for the first time since the Industrial Revolution, think about this, the first time, last month, Britain produced energy sufficient for its needs without burning coal. It's been burning coal for centuries. Other countries have stepped up, and the EU countries are being lobbied by several members in the EU to make this net zero commitment by 2050. So things are happening. And for those people who say, well, this is going to kill the economy, this is an example from Germany. Going back to 1990, they have increased their gross domestic product by 50%, and they've reduced their greenhouse gas emissions by 30%. Or 35%. So just because you're reducing emissions, that does not have a negative impact on the economy. In fact, it probably has a positive impact. If we turn to the United States, many states are taking action, and the leaders in the United States are California and Massachusetts. California passed the Global Warming Solutions Act in 2016. Massachusetts did the same thing in 2008. And the goal of these bills is to reduce emissions by promoting more energy efficiency, developing renewables, encouraging other alternatives to fossil fuel combustion. This is the situation in California. This is their GDP since 2000. It's been rising steadily. Here's their greenhouse gas emissions, which have been falling. So you can grow the economy and reduce emissions. In fact, Jerry Brown, the governor of California, argued that the reason the economy in California has grown is because they've reduced emissions, because that has spurred innovation, it's spurred new technology, it's developed new industries, that's been good for the economy. Here's the same thing for Massachusetts. I can't quite see the numbers there, but this is the GDP for Massachusetts, for the state, and this is the greenhouse gas decline. I think that's 11% and 60%, back to 1990. So we can see the same picture in Germany, in California, Massachusetts. Reducing greenhouse gases and growing the economy are not contrary, they are complementary. Cities are taking action. Other good news. This is an example. Mayor Bloomberg started this global initiative with big cities around the world, bearing in mind that half the people of the world live in cities. So that's a great place to start if you want to try to reduce emissions. 27 cities saw their emissions peak and fall since then, all these cities that signed on to this. And the way they did it was by decarbonizing their electricity systems, turning electricity production from fossil fuels to renewables, optimizing energy use, that means reducing waste in buildings, making them more efficient, providing cleaner and affordable alternatives to cars, improving public transportation, and cutting waste as much as possible. Other good news, businesses are taking action. Just before the Paris Agreement, 50 major businesses representing $1.5 trillion in revenue signed a letter calling for stronger action. 30 of these signatories have already reduced emissions by 9%, equivalent to taking 10 million cars off the road. Businesses can understand if you can reduce energy consumption, you're saving money. You're becoming more competitive. You can create new opportunities, new business opportunities. And so they're taking advantage of that. A leader in this has been Richard Branson, who has been challenging CEOs to think about ways of making money from this problem of global warming by inventing and developing new businesses. And finally, and most importantly, people are engaging, demanding action. And this has made a major difference, especially in the United States. And as a consequence, we have new Congress members like AOC. I love this picture. She's standing there talking, and all the older members, white members of Congress, are standing around listening to her. And she's telling them the way it should be. So hopefully we'll get her to come to Amherst in the fall, and we'll do this kind of thing again. And Ed Markey too. So the Green New Deal is aspirational. It sets a challenge, I think. It's not legislation. But I think we are indeed on the verge of an energy revolution, and the Green New Deal represents many of the aspects that we see. This energy revolution is good for the environment, it's good for people, it's good for the economy, it's good for jobs. I'll give you some examples quickly. Solar installations have been rising, and the cost per kilowatt of production has been falling steadily. Projecting going forward in time, this graph just goes off into the future. Electric cars have been rising. There's a whole bunch of them parked outside here. And so this graph is in millions of gallons of gas that have been saved each year. And now it's something like 350 million gallons of gas that would have been otherwise used. So that's good news. But here's the bad news. That's only 0.25% of US gasoline consumption. So it's rising, the use of electric cars is rising rapidly, but so is the use of big SUVs and trucks. So we're not really catching up to that trend. But don't be discouraged. Change can happen very, very quickly. And I'll give you this example here. This is 1900, this is Fifth Avenue in New York. Every one of these vehicles here is a horse-drawn wagon, except for this one car, this one vehicle, which is an internal combustion engine. 13 years later, every one of those vehicles is a car. There are no horses and carts. It happened in just about a decade. So imagine our energy future in a decade. And here's some recent headlines that tell you where this is going. Every one of these big companies is turning its fleet into electric. There are some car companies that have decided that within 20 years they won't make internal combustion engines anymore. So this is the way it's going, and I think the energy system will be transformed dramatically in a very short period of time. And lastly, let me tell you where I think the biggest changes are going to be, and that is in wind energy production, offshore. And you only have to travel in Europe to see where the future is here. There are enormous economic opportunities in the United States for wind power that haven't even been touched so far. Just an example, this is Vineyard Wind down here south of Martha's Vineyard. This is a single company. 800 megawatt of offshore wind is being developed, enough to power 400,000 homes. It'll be operational by 2021. It'll make Massachusetts the center of the offshore wind industry. 2,000 jobs, making salaries of $80,000 or more, compared to much lower rates in the state. And here's the beautiful irony. Here's this former coal power plant in Somerset, Mass. that has been transformed into a renewable energy center by these companies. They've invested $650 million so far to serve the offshore wind industry with a big inverter and with battery storage capacity. This is happening right here in Massachusetts. They had lease sales for other areas of Massachusetts. The leases made $405 million, 10 times what they made just 2 years ago. By 2030, that's just a decade from now, there'll be 18 gigawatts of offshore power, but just 7 companies, 7 offshore wind farms in the Northeast. And new projects have been proposed all the way up and down the West Coast and the East Coast too, even in the Great Lakes. $70 billion is expected to be spent on offshore wind in the next 10 years. This is an enormous industry, and it's not just putting up windmills. It's servicing those windmills, building new ships. These companies are building ships that have very low vibration motors so they won't disturb the marine mammals. It's very regulated. It has lots of jobs, not just in servicing and building the windmills, but in also bringing the energy ashore. So I'm quite convinced that this is going to be a massive energy revolution for the United States, and it's going to be good all around for everybody. So how can we all help? How can we add to this good news? Here's my formula for that. We have to vote. Vote, vote, vote. What Billy Bulger used to say, vote early and vote often. But when I say vote, I don't just mean at the presidential level, at the congressional level, I mean at every level. Local government, school boards, stockholder meetings. Vote, use your democratic rights to make changes happen, because that's what is the most important thing. And then after that, of course, we can make our own changes to the extent that we can within our economic capacity, reduce energy use. The simplest thing is to eliminate as much as possible the waste. We waste an enormous amount of energy. Insulate our homes, try to reduce our carbon footprint in that way. If we can, invest in renewable energy in some way, or if we have to replace our appliances, try to find the most energy efficient appliances and so on. If we can buy electric cars or hybrids, certainly do that. Buy our food locally. Let's not buy Fiji water at Whole Foods, which is being flown in from the South Pacific. If we can eat locally and perhaps eat less meat once or twice a week perhaps, or buy food meat that's grown on land that would otherwise be not used for anything else. And overall try to reduce waste and recycle. So our overall challenge is to engage in the democratic process, to push the agenda that we all believe in, to confront our political leaders and demand that they address these problems. We see this happening every day on the news. We must engage in this process. We have to work together, and we have to do this not just for the United States, but for a more sustainable and more equitable global society. We live in a global world. It's increasingly interconnected, and we have to recognize that the actions we take here affect people all over the world. And finally, I would just remember what Martin Luther King said in his speech, so-called I Have a Dream speech. And he was talking, of course, about civil rights. But he said, we don't have time to waste. And he used this phrase, there's the fierce urgency of now. We have to act because things are changing very quickly. And it's our responsibility to take hold of that and embrace it and try to make the changes that we would like to see in our environment. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bradley. That was, it's as you say, it's the good news is there. There is some, and we have to hang on to that and really work towards that. I know in the town of Amherst, the issue of equity affects our town as well. 40% of our population in Amherst is at or below the poverty level. I don't know how many people really totally understand that and what that means. That means we have 40% of our population is the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. So when we lose power, some of us have generators, but some of us are renters and don't have the ability to deal with that situation the way a lot of us just sort of take for granted. So we need to do things differently. We just recently had a municipal vulnerability program workshop where we had invited citizens to come and talk about climate change. And we had a real diverse group of people, and people talked and heard one another. And we went out to the community. We need to do more of that. We need to go out to the community. We need to help people understand what the vulnerabilities are, and we need to reach the population that isn't often at the table, and we need to make that change. That's just my personal push for that, and we need you to help make that happen. So I'd like to introduce our panelists, the next panelist that we'll hear from. Our next one brings over a decade of fierce dedication to protecting the environment. Her tireless efforts won her awards from the Massachusetts Association of Conservation Commissions, the Pittsfield Community Television, and the Housatonic Valley Association. She's been serving as the executive director of the Berkshire Environmental Action Team since 2006. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Jane Winn. And our next panelist probably doesn't really need an introduction from all of the people here in this room. He is someone we can be very proud of and are very proud of. His name is well known throughout the Pioneer Valley. From working to protect and preserve open space and making college more affordable and championing the efforts to end hunger at home and abroad, it's my pleasure and honor. Please welcome United States Congressman Jim McGovern.
Is this on? Okay. Thank you. I'd like to be sure everybody's got an index card and is.
I don't think your mic's
it's not on.
Yeah.
Just speak. Okay. So is that okay?
Yeah.
Good, thank you. Okay, so they're passing around index cards, and please, when you have a question that you're ready to pass in, raise it up, and somebody will pick it up for you. While we're waiting for some questions, I'd like to invite each of our panelists to make a short opening statement. We thought maybe you could tell us about how your own work on climate change has affected your lives. I wonder, Dr. Bradley, if you'd begin, because I know you have an interesting book out there.
Well, I sort of alluded to this, I think. Is that on? Yeah. I've worked on climate change my whole career. I began certainly not thinking about global warming. I was working in the Arctic many years ago, worried about glaciers advancing, and and the next ice age. But obviously things changed and the environment has changed dramatically. There are ice caps that I worked on in the 80s that are not there anymore, and completely gone. And the work that we did threatened some interest in Congress, and we were harassed, and our lives were turned upside down as certain congressmen tried to block what we were doing and to intimidate us. And I have to say that the person who saved our bacon, so to speak, was a Republican, Sherwood Bolett from New York, whom I've never met, but I dedicated my little book to him because without his support, he was chairman of the House Science Committee, I think our careers might have come to a sudden end as a result of that harassment. So I appreciate very much the support of congressmen who have real honor and understood what was at stake in terms of intimidation of scientists. So that's my own personal experience. I've tried to modify my own carbon footprint. I have solar panels and drive an electric car, but I'm in a different, I'm in a very fortunate position to be able to do that. I know not everybody can do that. But if we can all just try to reduce our footprint a little bit, that will help.
Ms. Winn?
First of all, I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. This is great. Glad to see so many people caring. I'm now the executive director of the Berkshire Environmental Action Team, but I grew up in Pittsfield on the banks of the very polluted Housatonic River. When I was growing up, when you went over a river bridge, you held your nose. If you stuck a stick down in the mud and wiggled it, plumes of brightly colored oil would come up. It even caught on fire outside my house when I was little, and I was out there probably breathing in all the PCBs that are still in the river. I think that really set me up to be an environmental activist later in life, although I did take a brief time where I was living in Ashfield and really enjoying raising children. And then I moved back to Pittsfield and started going to things like Conservation Commission meetings, trying to protect vernal pools, and seeing everywhere that our system was broken, from local regulations not being enforced up through the state, even federal laws that just weren't being enforced, and realizing that by being vocal about standing up for the law, I could make a difference, or a small group of us together could make a bigger difference. And I think that's what really inspires me, is learning that you as an individual can really make a huge difference. And I agree with Ray, definitely number one thing, get out there and vote early, vote often, but also take action. When you see something wrong, really stand up and do something about it. I was really pleased you brought up Martin Luther King. I was thinking there's a Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. And I certainly think we're living in interesting times. But rather than a curse, I see it as a huge opportunity. If you had the chance to go out and actually march with Martin Luther King, don't you wish you could be there? Well, now is a time where our whole planet is threatened. We have the opportunity to make a difference on a planetary scale. I think it's an exciting time, and we should all be doing what we can to take action.
Thank you. And Congressman?
Well, thank you. I'm the least qualified person to be on this panel because the two people sitting to my right have done incredible work in the area of climate change and protecting our environment and reminding us how important our environment is. I mean, I'm interested in this issue, and the reason why I'm interested in this issue is because I was fortunate enough to have good teachers beginning in first grade who taught me that science is important and they ought to pay attention to it, and that there are such things as facts. And, throughout my life, I have always relied on science as an indicator of how I should decide to come down on important issues. And the science, when it comes to the climate crisis, is overwhelming. I mean, when people say that the science is still out, I mean, I don't know, I want to pull out the remaining 2 strands of hair on my head, because the bottom line is the science overwhelmingly has come in to tell us that this is real, and that man has played a role, a major role, in contributing to this crisis. You know, I also worked for good people. I worked for George McGovern, who cared deeply about the environment and passionately about the environment. And I worked for a congressman from Boston for many years, Joe Moakley, who led the effort to clean up Boston Harbor. Some of you may remember, if you ever went to Boston not too long ago, you couldn't even stand near the harbor. It smelled so badly. All kind of sea life was dead. He launched a major effort at a cost of hundreds of millions of dollars, I should add, to clean up the harbor. And now sea life is back. I mean, I've even seen seals in Boston Harbor, and you can stand next to the water and not gag from the smell. But I got elected to Congress and said that these were issues that I cared about. And it's been frustrating, to be honest with you. I mean, Ray hinted to some of the crazy statements that come out of some of my colleagues. And I always debate whether or not it's genuine ignorance or whether it's deliberate ignorance. And it's a little bit of both. I remember having a debate in the Rules Committee, which I'm now the chair of, and this is when I was in the minority, and the issue of climate change got brought up, and I got into a debate with a congresswoman from North Carolina, a Republican, and she basically said it's not real. And so I just Googled climate change, and I said, would you yield to me? And I listed all the scientists and experts who have said that this is a real crisis. I said, we can debate about how we deal with it. That's a legitimate conversation. But there's really no debate about the fact that it's real and why it has come to be. And she said to me, Mr. McGovern, will you yield to me? I said, sure. She said, you have a habit of quoting scientists and experts. And I was like, and, you know, and she says, I want to say something to you, but I don't want you to respond. I just want you to listen. Promise me you'll just listen and not respond. And I said, okay. And she said, remember this, experts built the Titanic, but an amateur built the Ark. And she said, you promised me that you would not respond. I says, I'm not responding. I'm gasping for air because you took my breath away with that statement. I can't believe it. And one of the biggest problems has been a Congress that has refused to acknowledge that this is a real crisis and refused to do what we should have been doing, started doing a long time ago, actually making a transition away from fossil fuels to greener, cleaner, renewable energy. All the incentives should be there. I mean, the oil companies and the coal companies and the gas companies don't need any more incentives. I mean, we ought to be putting it toward making this transition. Barry Comrade talked about the solar transition. I remember when I was in college being so inspired by that. I mean, I would have thought back then that we would have been much farther along today than we are. But it has been the lack of resources. And then I'll just say one final thing. In talking about this issue, and Dr. Bradley brought this up, but I think we need to enforce this even more. When we talk about fixing this problem, it is not punitive. You know, you're not going to lose anything. It is not going to hurt you. It's the opposite. I mean, if we do this right, we're going to protect our planet, but we're also going to create millions and millions of new jobs and new opportunities. And I think that sometimes gets lost in this discussion. It really has to be reinforced. This is, as Ray pointed out, this is a moment of opportunity. And we either going to seize it or we're going to blow it. And I hope that we are up for the challenge.
Can I just add something to that?
Please.
There are people who are going to be hurt by this.
Well, those people we want to be hurt by it.
No. I wrote a little article about this because I think it's important that we get ahead of the problem, and that is, yes, there will be people who will lose their jobs, the coal mining communities and so on. But that's a relatively trivial problem to solve. We have to make sure those people are not hurt by the changes that take place. And so as part of the legislation or as part of the action, recognizing that overall there'll be huge economic opportunities, but we have to protect those people or help those people who are going to be displaced or have their jobs. Just like all the people who shoveled up the horse shit at the end of the 1900s when they replaced horses with vehicles.
And let me say, Ray's actually right. We have to make sure that there is a transition for those who are working in these industries. The people I was saying that might get hurt are the people who are making billions and billions and billions of dollars off of polluting our environment, and we need to bring an end to that. But we have the same conversation when it comes to reducing the military budget. And we always talk about the same people who are making missiles can make something else that we actually need. And we're not very good at making transition sound believable, and I think we have to do a better job of that.
Okay. Well, I got a proliferation of questions now, and I'm trying to make some order out of them. There are a whole bunch of questions here about electric cars, so maybe I'll start with those. One is, can you speak to the relative energy use in manufacturing an electric car relative to that saved in its use? I don't know if manufacturing electric cars is any more energy intensive than an ordinary car. Driving an electric car is not equal benefit in all states at all times, depends on where the power is generated and how. And also, apparently, this one is addressed specifically to Dr. Bradley. What would your response be to questions regarding the batteries used in electric cars, and what concerns do we need to be aware of?
So the Union of Concerned Scientists did a study of electric vehicles, and they looked at the sort of end-to-end production costs and energy use in making cars in their lifetime. And the conclusion was that no matter where you were in the United States, it was more beneficial to drive electric cars than to drive gasoline-driven cars. And of course, if you are able to use renewables to charge your cars, I have solar panels on my house, so I can plug my car in. But even if you're using grid electric, as long as it's produced by renewables, then of course that's beneficial. Ultimately, as we transition away from coal-powered energy production to renewable energy production, especially offshore wind, then it's going to be an absolute no-brainer that electric vehicles will be the right direction to go in. As far as batteries are concerned, yes, that is a big concern, but I read Nature every week, and there are just dramatic changes in the efficiency and the ability for people to make batteries out of more and more benign materials, not just lithium, but other materials. And I think if you fast forward again 10 years, the battery issue is going to be, again, dramatically different, much cheaper, much different, and we'll be making batteries out of much more readily available materials that have a much less impact on the overall environment.
Anyone else want to address anything about electric vehicles?
The one other piece I'd add is we already are good at making sure we collect batteries and really recycle them, as opposed to many of the plastics we use.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Let's get local here for a minute. A question here is, what can towns do, towns such as Amherst, to contribute to climate solutions, and how? Maybe we should be addressing Stephanie on this, but she's not up here. So what can you tell us? No, I don't mean that.
Oh.
Yeah.
Can I just
Yeah,
say
so let's-
something about I think the issues, the local issues are very much entwined with transportation issues. I mentioned the Global Warming Solution Act that was passed in Massachusetts, and that was to reduce energy emissions, I think it was 80% by 2050. Right now, the latest assessment is that it's almost impossible without dramatically grappling with transportation problem. Massachusetts has a terrible transportation system. Public transportation is absolutely atrocious, and that's true at the local level. We benefit from PVTA, but connecting even little towns like Leverett and Sunderland, Shutesbury, for people who want to come to work in Amherst, there is no alternative but to drive. And that simply exacerbates the problem. So we need more public transportation. We need our congressman to funnel billions of dollars from Washington so that we can have a train that connects Boston with Western Massachusetts. There isn't a city in Europe of comparable size that wouldn't have a fully integrated transportation system that's miles and miles ahead of what we have in Massachusetts, I'm afraid.
And I would say, we absolutely do. We need to understand that we have a less than adequate and less than efficient transportation system. That's why we need an infrastructure bill that will funnel not just billions but trillions of dollars across the country to fix it. I mean, I would like a presidential candidate to pledge that if he or she gets elected, over the next 10 years, they're committed to building the finest railway system in the world here in the United States of America. I mean, I think that would be something that, I can tell you, I'm from Worcester, and, we a few years back, we actually established commuter rail from Worcester to Boston. An enormous amount of traffic has been removed from the Mass Pike because people have found how it's much more pleasant to ride in a train than it is to sit in a parking lot on the Mass Pike, and is also saving lots of energy, and it's actually good for the environment. But it costs money, and there's a commitment. One of the challenges we have here in the state is that we kind of withdrew from a commitment to rail, and so we kind of sold off track to freight rail companies, and I want more products on freight rail and not on trucks. But as a result of that, we have a challenge now of access, of connecting the dots. It's going to cost a lot of money to do, but it is worth doing it. And if we were able to connect Boston to Worcester, out to the western part of the state, a lot of these communities, Orange and Athol, communities that are struggling economically, would all of a sudden, be a destination point, a place to live, because they're easy to get to, and people can live there and work in the western part of the state or in the central or eastern part of the state. So that's a part of it. I just say, and locally here, I mean, we should all commit to not building any more buildings, whether they're municipal buildings or state buildings, that are at least that at the very least they need to have a diversification of energy reliance. I'm still amazed that we build things and there are no solar panels. There's no, it's the same old. And we need to move away from that. I mean, when planning these buildings, may cost a little bit more in the short term, but in the long term, it will pay off. And we need to set an example.
I'd like to follow on that thought. Right now, I think by the end of the year, there's going to be an update to our standard building codes, and we certainly want to see our stretch building codes go to net zero, so that I'd like to see, thank you, no new buildings should be built that aren't zero net energy. I think there's lots more that cities and towns can do. I'm on the Pittsfield Green Commission, and we're just starting in on our revamped climate action plan, which is overwhelming for a volunteer committee. We're searching for getting help with it. But we're looking at things like truly green municipal aggregation. And we don't want to be just buying wind from far, far away. We want to keep it on the New England grid so that we're really changing New England's amount of renewables. I think if all the towns in Massachusetts were really willing to step up and do what they can afford to do to make our New England electricity greener, we can move faster. I don't think we're going to hit our goal for the Global Warming Solutions Act for 2020 is a 25% reduction, and as much as our dear governor says he thinks we're going to meet it, I don't see it. That's not what the graphs are showing me.
I'd just add one other thing, and that is when we think about transportation, we should also think about broadband access, because not everybody needs to drive to work 5 days a week if they have access to broadband, and companies and municipalities should encourage people to work from home. Telecommunication software is available. I have teleconferences every day with my colleagues, and it's you can get a lot done without leaving the comfort of your home. And there's another advantage. You can work in your PJs, which I often do.
Oh dear, when I use Zoom, we always have the cameras on, but we do have one employee who's currently in England who gets to Zoom into our staff meetings.
Okay, I have a question here. The question as written is, I think, intended for Congressman McGovern. Why did you co-sponsor the resolution for the Green New Deal? But maybe you could amplify also on some more specific bills that maybe are before Congress.
Why did I or why didn't I?
Well, it says, why did you?
I did, yeah, I did, okay, yeah, I did, yeah. Yeah, I did because I thought it was the right thing to do. And we need to make this a priority, right? So, I mean, look, the Green New Deal in many respects is aspirational, and we need to fill in the blanks. But it's a way to focus attention and discussion on the fact we need to do something. And it's kind of dramatic. Yeah, it is. Can we meet every goal in the Green New Deal? I mean, that's open to debate. But let's try. I mean, I think we're at the point now where we've kind of waited so long that we really, if we're going to take this challenge on, it has to be bold action, right? We have to be thinking big. It's not just, one solar panel. We have to commit to a solar transition. And we have to be engaged as well with the rest of the world. And we also have to understand, again, that, because the Green New Deal also talks about, environmental justice as well, that there are communities, even when we decide to be good on the environment, that get left behind. So I think it's spurring a discussion, and I think I would like to see it come to the floor. I mean, not quite yet. We need to do some more grassroots advocacy on behalf of it, but it is the right thing to do. And look. We can debate, what are the specific steps that we need to take to reach these goals, and that's a debate we should be having. And so I did it because I thought it was the right thing to do, and I want to make this a priority. And I give Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez credit for helping kind of organize this effort. And look, when people say to me, "Oh, we can't do this, we can't do that," my response to them is, "Well, what do you propose? What is your idea? How do you?" What's your suggestion on how we deal with this? And I'll just say one other thing. The other thing I'm proud that I co-sponsored was H.R. 1, and that is a huge overhaul of our campaign finance laws. I really believe that one of the reasons why that we have not moved more aggressively on these issues is because of the money that comes in to fuel congressional campaigns and political parties. And I got to tell you, until we get money out of this system, the corporate money in particular, I think it's going to be a really, really difficult fight. And the final thing I'm going to say that gives me hope, because I liked your good news. The other good news is that a lot of people who are showing up to events and who are inviting me to schools are not just college students, they're high school students, middle school students. I spoke to a group of sixth graders here in Amherst that grilled me, that knew more about the science and the details of what needed to be done than most of my colleagues. I think for this generation, I think the climate crisis really is this generation's Vietnam. And I think this is the issue that is bringing people together to demand change. I don't think they're going to tolerate members of Congress who aren't going to be bold on this issue. And I said, I know that was the final thing, but the other thing you ought to know is that when I became the chairman of the Rules Committee this year, I have to establish the rules for this Congress. And one of the things we wrote into the rules was we established a special select committee on the climate crisis. So in addition to the committees of jurisdiction, we have a committee that is just focused on how to deal with the climate crisis. So, you know, there are more people that have an opportunity to participate in how we solve this problem.
Anybody want to add to that? Not right now. Okay, we have a whole lot of questions here that I think I will just try to summarize. They have to do with the perceived or possibly real conflict between saving trees and building fields of solar panels. One group here tonight believes that the math concerning cutting acres of trees for solar makes sense. My observation, that is the person who wrote this card, is that the math is not accurate. Do any of you feel qualified to address that?
I'd like to start with asking, why are we cutting trees when we've got so many places we should be putting solar panels that doesn't require it?
I mean, I think that's quite right, that trees suck CO2 out of the air. That's a good thing. And as you say, there are many places where we can add solar panels. If you just look at every shopping mall, the roofs are, devoid of solar panels. UMass has built solar panels over many of their big parking lots. Why can't we do that? Those are the logical places. Instead of having just acres and acres of asphalt, let's just have solar panels. It'll cool off the cars and generate the same amount of power.
Now, I'm not a scientist, but correct me if I'm wrong. I'm told that the older the trees are, the more CO2 they suck out of the environment. Is that true or not?
Yeah, I must admit, I think it depends. It depends a lot on what the trees are and what the stage of the ecosystem is. I can't say there's a definitive answer on that.
But whatever the ultimate answer is, I mean, we all do know that trees play a role in helping sucking the CO2 out of the environment, and I agree. I mean, I don't know why we would do that. I also get concerned when farmland that is already cleared are also turned into solar fields, if you will, because I think I'm somebody who believes we ought to be growing more food here closer to home. Now, it's a challenging dilemma because we have some people who can't make their farms work, and so do you say you can't do this? You can't turn your farm into a solar farm because it's your land and you want to be able to earn a living. But we ought to be. There are ways we can try to get around that. But I agree with both of my colleagues up here that I think that there are plenty of other places that you can put solar panels and not, cut down trees or destroy farms.
Can I just add one tangent? The other thing that our current governor is trying to do is to make our renewable portfolio standards weaker so that you can burn biomass even less efficiently. And I think that's an even bigger problem than cutting it down for solar farms.
I think that was also mentioned on one of these cards, yeah. I have a couple of really kind of technical questions that are for Dr. Bradley, I think. One is, what percentage of sea level rise is due to ocean warming and what versus recent glacial melt?
Well, that is going to change over time. I think right now, most of the sea level rise that we've seen is related to warming. But the question is, how quickly will the major ice sheets, Greenland and Antarctica, give up their ice to the oceans? And there's a lot of work being done on that in my department. Rob DeCanto is one of the leaders on this. And I think increasingly as we go forward, there'll be no question that most of the rise in sea level will be because of melting ice and the movement of that material into the ocean. answer.
And another one here is, are there better estimates these days of how much methane is being contributed to the atmosphere by fracking?
By fracking?
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
I
Jane
do.
is- Okay.
And I think this frequently goes back to a paper that had looked at anthropogenic methane going in, so human-created methane going in to the atmosphere and the actual fingerprint of it compared to agricultural methane. And at the time the paper came out, it said, well, it really looks more like it's agriculture that's been the big increase recently. And, oh dear, Robert Howarth has done a great video on YouTube that really goes through the fingerprinting and the current state of the knowledge, and it turns out, no, that's not really true, and he explains it beautifully why it's really showing that it's fracking that's putting the methane into the air, not cows burping.
Thank you. Here's a question. I don't know. I haven't read this book, so I can't tell you what's really going on here. But the question is, are the calculations in the book Drawdown accurate? And in particular, refrigerants are released most in Africa and South America. I'm not quite sure what the calculations in Drawdown are referring to.
I'm not familiar with the book. I don't know.
Okay.
Refrigerants are chlorofluorocarbons, and they deplete the ozone in the atmosphere. Many of them are also very potent greenhouse gases themselves. So there has been a global effort to reduce those greenhouse gases. They're entirely man-made, and I think that is slowly happening.
Okay, there's a couple questions here along the lines of, are renewables enough to take care of our energy supply, or are we going to need nuclear to as well? And will we ever really be able to meet our energy needs?
Yeah, so this is a very difficult question to answer. Certainly nuclear could contribute relatively minimal CO2 to the atmosphere, except in terms of construction. And it would potentially relieve us from the burden of having to produce energy by other means. However, and I think I've told some of you this story before, I was asked by a consulting company to evaluate their report to the Department of Energy on the high-level nuclear waste depositories in Utah. And the question I was asked is their report on how the climate will change over the next 1,000,000 years accurate? And the reason that question arose, of course, is that a lot of this high-level nuclear waste is toxic and dangerous for many hundreds of thousands of years. And I thought to myself, well, if we have to ask that question, this is not a great solution to our energy problem. So, yes, you could build nuclear power plants. We don't have a good solution to what to do with the high-level nuclear waste. We have it stacking up in places all over this country and all over other countries. Nobody has yet come up with a really viable solution to that. Now, there are some new nuclear power technologies that produce nuclear waste that only is toxic and dangerous for a few hundred years. Yeah. So you have to make a decision of whether that's an appropriate legacy for our future generations or not.
But can you answer whether wind and solar can power everything?
Well, I've seen various estimates that say that's possible. Certainly, I think if we invested in offshore wind to the extent that has happened in Western Europe and other countries, we would be energy sufficient. I don't I'm not a great fan of onshore wind, although in many parts of the Midwest, up and down from Texas up to North Dakota, there are huge amounts of energy being produced, and people are making a lot of money, and it's allowing farming to continue. So that's a good thing. But I don't think we should be putting huge windmills on top of hills in scenic areas. I think it's much better to have it offshore. And I think with the development of offshore wind, like I described, plus the general increase in dispersed solar generation, that is dispersed so everybody has solar on their homes, we can have plenty of energy for the future.
And let me just say, I've always been somewhat skeptical of nuclear power. I visited 3 Mile Island shortly after the accident happened when I was working for then Senator George McGovern and talking to the people who worked at the plant and also who lived in the area. The people who lived in the area were frightened out of their minds because they had no idea that such a thing could possibly happen that might actually threaten their safety. And then, we saw what happened in Fukushima. I mean, things happen, and if something bad happens, the impact is astronomical. Last week we had a group of members of Congress who were trying to push forward an appropriation to fund this Yucca Mountain site in Nevada, which I blocked in the Rules Committee, because the idea that we're going to take nuclear waste and truck it, from Massachusetts, all across the country to Nevada, to a site that is uncertain whether it is an appropriate site, doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I mean, if there's an accident, if there is a terrorist attack against the truck, I mean, the danger and the lack of debate around the implications of that danger, I think, should concern everybody. So I meet with people all the time who tell me that nuclear power is the be-all and end-all. I'm just not there.
Thank you. Dr. Bradley mentioned the possibility of really much more distributed energy system if everybody starts getting solar panels. So I have a question here about how would the proliferation of solar energy impact the grid in such a distributed system?
Well, I'm not a technical expert on this, but I believe that what has been happening over the last few years has been a very dramatic development in battery technology and storage facilities and so on. And so I think that the energy that as time goes on, that buffer, if you like, that buffer for storing energy will help smooth out the ups and downs of energy production, both seasonally and also from wind. And as I showed in one of my slides, that at Somerset, Mass, they're building a $400 million battery storage facility. And so they understand that this energy production is periodic. And so, again, those people who are smart and technical and engineers have come up with solutions. That's part of the innovation process. That's part of the economic development that we need. And there are a lot of very smart people here at UMass and elsewhere who are working on this very issue to try to get ahead of these little technical issues that come up.
I think another place where a lot is being done is ISO New England. They're the sort of air traffic controller of our grid. And there's a wonderful video that they have up about how much they're doing on weather forecasting to be able to predict when solar panels are going to be producing and also when wind turbines are going to be producing, so that they'll have a better way of forecasting that all into the grid and also making it more economical. Now if we can just get National Grid and Eversource to actually let our water heaters talk to the grid so that we can be deciding when we're going to be purchasing electricity, we could get it so we've got real transactional energy and even things out more, especially with battery backup.
No, I just would make a pitch that I think nationally and even in our state, we need to have an energy policy. Because we pass legislation that sets goals and aspirations, but we really don't have an energy policy, and we really need to have one. People always ask, can we power Massachusetts on solar and wind alone? I don't know the answer to that, but you know what? We have smart people in this state, at UMass, all around the place. I mean, they ought to be charged to help figure out how do we move to a system that is totally renewable and green and clean. Same nationally, because I think if we were able to spell it out in black and white for people, I think it'd be a lot easier for people to buy into it. Because the critics will tell you you can't do any of this stuff. It's so phenomenally expensive. It'll ruin your economy. It'll do. The whole world will come to an end. But it is doable, and but we need to think, statewide, regionally, and certainly nationally. We haven't had an energy policy in this country, as long as I've been alive. But I think now's the time. If there was a time to think it out, it ought to be now. And we have the brain power. We just need to have the political will to do it.
Oh, let's see. Okay, this isn't addressed to anyone in particular, but I think it probably is meant for Congressman McGovern. Why is the Democratic Party forbidding a climate change debate? And please, let's see. This is actually a separate question.
So I guess, why is the Democratic Party?
Why is the Democratic Party, actually, I think it's the DNC, forbidding a climate debate?
Well, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. But the bottom line is that there's multiple debates, and you could turn them into a climate debate. And I expect that some of the candidates that are running that are saying that this is their number one priority will do that. Will reinforce over and over and over again why this is an important issue. So I expect that this will be discussed quite extensively during the campaign. And I'm quite frankly very pleased to see a number of candidates that are running who say this is their top issue. And I think that is a welcome development in our politics. I think the politics on the national level is changing. And my hope is that, in the next election, that more and more people who are climate change deniers will not be returned to Washington, and more people who actually believe we ought to do something about this will win election instead. And look, let me just talk a little bit about the politics of this. I think we need to be careful that we're not insisting on perfection with all of our candidates, because we're not going to get. I'm going to tell you, there's not too many perfect congressmen. I voted for a perfect congressman once. That's when I first ran for Congress. But then I served 2 years, and I wasn't so perfect anymore. But I voted for me anyway because I was a hell of a lot better than the guy who ran against me. The deal is that I want as many people as possible to sign on to the Green New Deal. I think that is an important thing to do, and I want to have that debate. But just because somebody doesn't sign on to that doesn't mean they can't be helpful in other areas. I mean, we need to move appropriations. We need to move tax incentives. We need to move a whole bunch of things to actually make all of this a reality. I think the key is making sure that whoever is in office, whether it's at the local level, the state level, or federal level, is actually pushing the ball forward. If people are not on all the 10 top bills, that doesn't mean they're bad. It just means, we need to push them a little bit more, but they can be helpful in other ways. And I think we need to focus on moving the ball forward. Actually making sure. Dr. Bradley talked about Sherrod Boland, a Republican from New York State. I served on the Transportation Committee with him. He was a moderate Republican, but he got it when it came to basic research and the importance of protecting the environment. And he tried to put together a bill to reauthorize the EPA, that he was trying to make it palatable to both Republicans who were in control of the House and Democrats. He didn't quite succeed, but nonetheless he succeeded in other areas. So I think, we need to make sure that we're just moving the ball forward.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, let's talk a little bit about Boston and what they should or could or be doing about the potential sea level rise, according to the map that you showed, or other cities, but Boston is close to home.
Well, it is for some cities an existential problem because it's something you can't stop. Sea level is going to rise, and we are going to have to accept that some areas are not going to be viable. And we have, as a community, we're going to have to decide which areas we want to protect and which areas we want to allow to return to coastal wetlands the way it was. So those are going to be very tough decisions. The country that's grappled with this most is the Netherlands, Holland, who for years have lived with the threat of inundation because much of their territory is below sea level. And their response was to build a system of dams and dikes along the coast to protect their areas, and they've actually reclaimed a lot of land that was below sea level and taken good advantage of that for agriculture and other things. And they've recently developed a new plan to build up their dikes and dams to a high level, and they've accepted the cost, and they've actually embraced it in a very positive way and said, well, this gives us new opportunities to redesign our highways and create new parks and wetlands and so on. So I think we're going to have to come to some collective decisions about how to do that. And unfortunately, a lot of land use decisions are made at the local level, and a lot of zoning and so on, that people are going to be losers economically because you can't protect every property on the coast. It's just not going to happen.
Any additions? So that kind of leads into a question that's kind of skeptical here. I'll read it this way, that there are going to be some losers. Do you really believe that we can transition to renewable energy and continue with the level of energy that we are accustomed to? Don't you believe that we have to drastically reduce consumption? Do you believe that people will have to sacrifice?
I think we can. I think the sacrifice is the wrong word. I think people need to modify or amend how they think about energy. Vast amounts of energy are simply wasted. If you want to think about sacrifice as not insulating your home or your next home to the level to make your house much more efficient, okay. If you think sacrifice is driving a car that gets 10 miles to the gallon or 15, okay. Those are sacrifices for sure that you would have to make. But there are alternatives that wouldn't drastically alter your lifestyle or your ability to have a happy life and do so in a much more energy efficient way. So I think it's a false sort of illusion to think that we can't do things without really suffering. That's not the case.
I'm not quite sure I'd agree. I have a sister-in-law who buys everything she sees, eats a meal, puts it in the refrigerator, and a week later ends up throwing it out. And I think she's going to think that she's sacrificing. I think she's much less happy than most people I know, and I hope that when it comes time that she actually can't have her buying every last thing she sees and throwing it away a week later. I think she'll actually be happier, so maybe you're right, it's not sacrifice, but there are people who are going to have to change.
Your sister-in-law's not in the audience, is she?
No, and won't see this on TV.
Yeah, no, yeah, I mean, again, I mean, I think a lot of people, I go back to what I said at the beginning, a lot of people think this is punitive. So, I mean, maybe we have to convince people that it isn't. You know, believe it or not, I know the guy who currently owns the Empire State Building. And when he bought the Empire State Building a few years back, he realized it was one of the most inefficient buildings in terms of, you know, insulation, and everything was so outdated. I mean, they were spending countless millions of dollars every year in costs that basically were just seeping through the walls and the windows. And they went through and retrofitted the building with better insulation, with new windows, state-of-the-art, and basically, you know, that investment has saved them countless millions of dollars a year. And so he's using less energy. He's paying less because he fixed the building, and that money could then be used to hire more people to do other things that need to be done. I mean, there's, you know, getting this right again presents, you know, all kinds of opportunities for people, and if we don't get it right, the costs are going to continue to rise, and other things are happening. Ray mentioned in his opening about climate refugees. I mean, increasingly, more and more people who are coming, who are leaving their countries to go to other countries, including the United States, people coming from Central America to here are climate refugees. Not just people fleeing violence, but people fleeing areas that they can no longer grow anything because of severe droughts and no water. You know, I was in Africa a few years back looking at food aid programs, and we're driving, and the guy who was driving the Jeep said to me, "Look over there, there's Mount Kilimanjaro." And I remember the book, The Snows of Kilimanjaro, right? And the snows seemed really dinky. I could barely see them, right? And he said that there's been a dramatic shift in the last few years. Like, this hasn't been like, you know, minuscule shifts that he noticed. I mean, in a few years' time, he noticed a major shrinkage of the snow cap. And then he went on and gave me a lecture about how the entire continent of Africa, you know, this is happening. There's less water coming into the valley. Soils aren't as rich and good for growing things. People are moving to other areas. There's fights over water. There's fights over land. It's, you know, so it's resulting in conflict as well. So there's all these spin-offs that are happening because of this that are really severe. I don't think it's sacrifice. I think it's a win-win-win-win for everybody. And yeah, there will be people who are working in the fossil fuel industry who will be displaced. But I mean, I got to believe that we're smart enough to help provide a transition plan to help them go into something else.
Thank you. So that leads very nicely into the next question here. What Dr. Bradley showed us these graphs that showed that Europe and the United States were responsible for most of the carbon in the air and the atmosphere now. What is our responsibility to help fund green development in the underdeveloped world?
Under the Paris Agreement that President Trump says he's withdrawing from, the developed countries agreed to put forward a large amount of money to help the developing world to grow their economies, to develop without the use of fossil fuels. And so this was, in a sense, foreign aid that countries would contribute. And it's essential that we do that. And let's face it, a lot of foreign aid that we give out today benefits our own economy, because it's American technology that is being used to help those other countries establish wind farms or other technologies that would help them avoid having to burn fossil fuel. So I think if you can look at it as a self-interest in a way, but it's also a moral obligation that we have, because it's the developed world that has created the environmental problem that we have today.
And I agree, and that's why I thought the Paris Accord was such an important step, because the nations that are well off agreed to help the nations that weren't so well off be able to make the necessary adaptation. In 2008, I was I visited Ecuador, and I had visited some of the rainforests, and it was really disturbing that indigenous communities were basically being wiped out because of development, and all that came with the development, and that there were areas that were quite polluted. I visited an area where Texaco, now Chevron, had an oil operation, and they didn't put covers in their oil pits. And anyway, they did a terrible job. The oil is leaking all over the place. It's an area the size of Rhode Island, seeping into the Amazon. People who live in these areas, are getting cancer at an earlier age and at rapid rates. And anyway, I met with the president of Ecuador, and I said to him, President Correa at the time, and I said, it's really shocking to me how the Amazon seems to be being destroyed. Part of it because of foreign exploitation, but part of it because you, the government of Ecuador, keep on allowing for more and more development into these very precious areas. And he said, well, I have a plan. And the plan is that, that the global community basically help provide us assistance to not develop in that land. So because the Amazon is so important to the whole world, right? I mean, you give us, you give us money so that we don't have to develop in order to be able to provide for our people. And I thought at first it sounded kind of like a strange idea, but then the more I thought about it, I said, this is really not a bad idea. This is actually a pretty good idea. And I remember talking to some people in the Obama administration when I came back. It's an idea that didn't take off, but part of what we can do is to help protect some of this precious land and these precious forests that aren't on our own soil here, because that's incredibly important. I mean, if the entire Amazon gets developed, I mean, we have, we're in even worse shape. But we need to be thinking out of the box, and we need to understand that we have an obligation to help some of the developing world comply.
Okay, I think we're almost at the end of our time. I'd like to invite each of you to sum up your thoughts or make a final statement, if you'd like. Who would like to start?
Boy, I think what I'd like to end with is asking each of you to make sure that you're really doing what you can. Go outside your comfort zone. I'll have to say, when I started however many years ago, the idea of public speaking terrified me. Now I'm comfortable speaking to crowds of 1,000 or more, all because I kept going outside my comfort zone. Every time I saw something that I thought was a problem that I might be able to change, I have this obsession now of actually trying to change it. It drives my husband crazy. But I suggest drive your partner crazy. Step outside your comfort zone, take action, and make sure you vote.
I'd like to just add one additional thought to the other things we've discussed, and Jim McGovern reminded me to say this. There was a report just came out about the loss of biodiversity around the world, because it's tied into the whole issue of climate change. But personally, I'm as much concerned about that issue as climate change, because extinction is forever, and we're losing tremendous biodiversity resources around the world. And so we have a moral obligation to help other countries to find alternative ways of developing their energy so that they won't impact the biodiversity of their countries, especially in the tropics, where it's so important that we try to maintain that biodiversity, which benefits everybody on the planet. I don't think we want to be the generation that loses many of the iconic species that we are so familiar with, and that's happening partly because of climate change, partly because of neglect and lack of moral compass, if you like, in terms of dealing with our relationship with other countries. So that's something we have to also wrap into our concerns about climate change.
So I think my final thoughts are that, look, we're living in a time where it's easy to get overwhelmed because there's so much to be concerned about. And I think sometimes people feel like there's nothing you can do about anything, so they pull the shade. And I think we have to figure out a way to motivate people in a way that they don't pull the shade, that they get involved. And they don't have to, it doesn't have to be, a lifetime sabbatical, protesting in the streets every day, although people want to do that, that's good. But I mean, you're making sure that the people who are elected actually know that you care about this stuff. Politicians, no matter what their political persuasion, all have one thing in common. We all want to get reelected, right? And so when people hear from members of their community, it makes a difference. It really does. It could be an email, it could be a postcard, it could be a visit. Just if everybody did a little bit of something in advocacy, things would change at a more rapid pace. The other thing is that Ray put up a list of things that we all can do, right? I mean, you don't have to do all of them. If you do one of them, it's helpful. If we bought more food locally, I mean, it helps our farmers, so it helps our local economy. It's better for us. It's better for the environment, and we ought to praise those farmers in our area here who do good farming. I mean, who are returning to sustainable agriculture, returning to sustainable animal agriculture, getting the animals off the feedlot and back onto the farm. That's a big deal. We ought to find ways to incentivize and reward farmers that do that. And if we do that, then more and more farmers will follow. I think more and more are already beginning to go in that direction because they realize consumers are looking for that more and more, and hopefully that'll continue. The final thing I'm going to say is that this is fixable. We're still at a moment where we can actually do this. A few more years of inaction, and Ray will give his presentation, and there'll be no good news, right? But we're still at a moment when we can make a difference here. This is a time for people to step up and for people to be active and to have these conversations. And look, I'm not a scientist and I'm not an expert. That's why I like to be on panels with people who are. But we need to listen to those who know what they're talking about, and then we need to then turn that into policy and actually make a real difference here. So I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that we can do this. So thank you.